If I told you that the James Bond short story collection we never got was Octopussy and The Living Daylights, you might think there's a slight problem with that statement. And you'd be wrong, for there are several million problems with that statement, all of them printed and some of them going back as far as 1966 when they were published as a short story collection, called Octopussy and The Living Daylights. But you'd also be wrong for a different reason. When it comes to posthumous publications, the author's intent is not always clear. We cannot be sure how much the finished product might have been different from what we got. If the work was left narratively unfinished, we might not even be sure how the story might have ended. However, Octopussy and The Living Daylights stands out in that, unlike most posthumous publications, it's a short story collection, not a novel, leaving us with a bunch of stories which were all individually finished, but which don't add up to what the author intended. Let me explain. The collection includes Octopussy, The Property of a Lady, The Living Daylights, and 007 in New York. While seeming comparable to the first Fleming Bond collection, For Your Eyes Only, this collection is just one story shorter, the publication history alone bears testament to what a mess it is. When it was first published, Octopussy and The Living Daylights worked not just as a title, but also as a contents page. The book included nothing else and, at 95 pages long, had less substance than a 70s Bond film. Only 1 year later, the paperback edition saw the addition of Property of a Lady, a Fleming story written in early 1963 for Sotheby's annual journal, The Ivory Hammer, hence that story's auction room backdrop. The fourth story, 007 in New York, was added a few years later. And by a few, I mean 32 years after the collection's first appearance. Originally published in the New York Herald Tribune in October 1963, it was subsequently republished in the 1964 US edition of Thrilling Cities, where it was included as an apology for Ian Fleming's less than thrilled assessment of New York City. The apology is somewhat perfunctory, as the story is only 8 pages long, including a recipe for scrambled eggs. Had Fleming completed the collection, it seems highly doubtful that either 007 in New York or Property of Lady would have featured in it. The former is a shaggy dog story and an anecdote published as an apology, while the latter so disgusted Fleming that he refused his fee for writing it. In fact, at the time of Fleming's death, only The Living Daylights had A. been printed, and B. received Fleming's approval. Not only was it printed more than once, but Fleming even had new artwork commissioned for its second impression, at the cost of 110 guineas, which, adjusted for inflation, is exactly one fuckton of money. As for Octopussy, well, there is little evidence either way, but I think it would probably have stayed in, as it fits quite well into the mould of experimentation that featured in 2 of the 5 stories in For Your Eyes Only. Personally, I don't find any of these stories bad, and the completionist in me is glad that they exist in book form and flesh out the, still short, collection. But the fact remains that this collection is a testament to what was left, not what was envisioned. Even the running order of these stories shows a certain amount of carelessness, making the final James Bond story ever an 8-page anecdote with a rushed, anticlimactic ending. The slapdash attitude to the short stories Fleming left behind still isn't quite over. Fleming left behind several other unfinished James Bond stories, and it has only been over the last few years that this material has seen the light of day. Even then, this material has been used to augment and market yet more Bond novels, not short stories. It would be kind to assume this is respect rather than neglect. But Forever and a Day, the latest Bond continuation novel and the second one to use some short story material, is the 28th continuation novel, meaning the series has tripled since Fleming. And that's not counting other ventures, such as the 9 Young Bond books and the 3 Moneypenny diaries. So we can't exactly call the estate aloof. To be fair, what Fleming left has a somewhat complicated status. Not only was much of it not written for the 2 collections, but it also predates them, and was made for a different medium. To explain that, we have to go even further back, to the first James Bond short story collection. For Your Eyes Only drew 3 of its stories, from treatments Fleming wrote in 1958 for a proposed CBS Bond TV series. Sources differ on how many there were in all. It has been said by Anthony Horowitz amongst others that Fleming's CBS pitch was for 13 episodes, though no one seems to have ever claimed that Fleming came up with that many stories. 2 of them were used as episodes in novels, meaning that either way there were still only 4 Fleming had left to draw on for his second collection, including the one entitled Murder on Wheels, which was used for Anthony Horowitz's continuation novel Trigger Mortis. Some editions even included the treatment as a bonus, and Russian Roulette, which that same author used for Forever and a Day. However, we should also remember that Fleming passed over these 4 stories' ideas at least once when he wrote For Your Eyes Only. As for his successor, Anthony Horowitz, the fact that the second story he chose was far less developed or carefully plotted than the first one suggests that by the 4th one we might simply be looking at 4 words scribbled on a napkin. Fleming was, after all, trying to sell a TV show, so his quest for episode ideas might have emphasised quantity over quality. Maybe after time had passed and that deal had fallen through, he came to regret all 4 of these story ideas. Or maybe he didn't. When he died, Fleming was working on 2 short stories, and so it seems fair to assume that these at least were definitely intended for the collection. One of them, consisting of just a page and a half, involved Bond, a card dealer named Zographos, and some Russians, while the other is simply a 2-paragraph opening, a description of an early and routine morning in Bond's life. Where the latter might have gone we cannot know, but the former, like Russian roulette, involves gambling, Russians, a Monte Carlo casino, and people destined to be either bookmakers or suckers, suggesting that it could have been an updated and more effective version of that story. So, Octopussy, Russian roulette, Murder on Wheels, The Living Daylights, and something else? There are some unrelated Fleming Bond notes for a villain named Mr. Zaz, the Bulgar proverb, my enemy's enemy is my friend, and some sentences which might have been used. Even less complete, Fleming made notes for some plot ideas at different points. If we ignore all of these and simply go with the most developed idea, the fullest treatment called Murder on Wheels, then our second collection is a tempting mirror of its predecessor, with one story in which Bond is sent off to kill someone, one story mostly told in flashback by someone other than Bond about events that didn't include him, and one story with a climax in which Bond replaces someone at the wheel of a vehicle in order to find an assassin during a high-speed ride. This doesn't take into account all the stories, and isn't really an argument for the inclusion of any of this new material, as such a lineup could have been boringly repetitive. If anything, it could suggest that maybe all these old fragments had already been discarded by Fleming, replaced by more recent ideas that he never got around to putting on paper in any form. However, he was always a keen recycler. Moonraker, Dr. No and Thunderball all began as something else, sometimes even with a different protagonist, and with only The Living Daylights, and probably Octopussy meeting his standards for new work in the last 2 years, returning to already developed ideas in some form or another must have appealed. At the time, he was bemoaning how he was running out of ideas for Bond, and that The Man with the Golden Gun would be his last Bond novel. Said novel was having such a protracted birth that he was considering spending an unprecedented extra year fixing the first draft. Working on a second short story collection could have been a logical next move, giving him an extra Bond outing without the pressure of coming up with more stories, and allowing him to clear the decks of the last few scraps and story ideas. So maybe even the finished collection would have been a symptom of both the character and the author's mortality. We never got the Octopussy that was intended, and that's no one's fault, but its trickle-like publication history shows that Ian Fleming's legacy as a short story writer has been somewhat neglected by his publishers. The novels might live in the shadow of the films, but the short stories are in the shadow of both, having had to wait for more than 24 continuation novels to be published before they were gathered together. This fate isn't even unique to Fleming. Several other authors have tried their hand at Bond short stories. Raymond Benson wrote 4 and published 3, Samantha Weinberg published 2, and Charlie Higson 1. But even those authors have only seen theirs published in book form simply to flog the novels, mostly as bonus material in omnibus collections. To this day, the only Bond short story collection since Fleming is an unofficial Canadian one. Film Bond has moved on from book Bond. Maybe book Bond tried to move on from book author, and only nostalgia and a sense of legacy has brought them back together now. Whatever the reason, the Octopussy collection stands as a monument and a reminder that unlike Bond, the author left, leaving only a question mark behind.